Good evening and good morning, wherever you're joining us from, for this very special global executive panel from the VLGA and LGIU on community wealth building. My name is Chris Eddy, and it is my pleasure to be the facilitator of this discussion. I'll introduce our panelists in just a moment, but firstly, I would like to, on behalf of the VLGA and LGIU, acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria, across Australia, and wherever you are dialing in from for this session today. We recognise the continuing connection to land, waters and community of the traditional owners and pay our respects to them, to their elders, past, present and future, and to their cultures. We'll take about an hour and 15 minutes for this session. And before we get into the discussion, I would like to invite Catherine Arndt, the CEO of the VLGA, to formally welcome you all to today's session.
Thank you for that welcome. And also I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today. And it's my great pleasure to, I guess, be co-hosting this event alongside Chris Eddy today on behalf of the VLGA and also our partner LGIU, and I welcome our colleagues in the room from LGIU tonight. Delighted to have such a stellar panel lined up, and I know Chris will introduce each of our panelists shortly, but I too would like to acknowledge and thank them for making their time available to us to talk about what is, I guess, a really interesting concept or initiative, community wealth building, particularly during this time of COVID, when we see, people are living and working more than ever before in their local communities and municipality, and that the importance of community in place has been highlighted, I think, perhaps more so than it ever has during this time. I thank all of you in the room for your attendance tonight, and also in the morning. Craig, I know that's where you are in the morning over there in Scotland. But before I hand back to Chris, I would just like to acknowledge that the VLGA board met prior to this event tonight, and I'm pleased to announce that Councillor Denise Massoud has been elected as the VLGA's president for a 2-year term. So welcome, Denise, and congratulations.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I'm honoured, to be honest.
Thank you. Chris, back to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Congratulations, Denise. So let's get into our topic for this evening, the topic of community wealth building. And I want to briefly introduce our panellists. Firstly, over there in Scotland this morning, joining us, first cab off the rank for his busy day, I'm sure, is Craig Hatton, the CEO of North Ayrshire Council. Hi, Craig.
Hi everybody. Really pleased to be with you this morning. When I was telling my team that I was zooming into Australia, 2 years ago, it would have been probably a more excitable Zoom for me than this morning, including a visit. But here we are with the wonders of modern technology. So really pleased to be here this morning.
Fabulous. And we'll come back to you very shortly. The CEO of the City of Sydney, we're delighted to have with us Monica Barone. Hi, Monica.
Hi, everyone. And yes, I'm so pleased to be here too. I'm really looking forward to this panel discussion. Thank you.
And we'll hear about the different stages of the journey that Craig and Monica's councils are on in relation to community wealth building. But we want to start by explaining the concept, finding out where it's come from, how it is taking hold in various parts of not just Australia, but around the world. And to help us with that, we have Patrick Fensham, Principal and Partner from SGS Economics and Planning. Pat, good evening to you and welcome.
Thanks very much. I'm really pleased to be here and on this great panel as well. Looking forward to the conversation.
Terrific. Now, each of our speakers have just a few slides. It's certainly not going to be death by PowerPoint, just to help make their main points. So if we can ask Steve, who's helping us to bring up Pat's slides. Pat will take us through the concept and the pillars of community wealth building. So for this introductory piece, Pat, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. All right. Well, look, the idea of community wealth building, or the concept, I think really emerged from a group in the US called the Democracy Collaborative. They were particularly focused on building up the cooperative economy. In the UK, it's the Centre for Local Economic Strategies who's been running hard with the concept. and the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, or CLES, have been working with lots of cities and jurisdictions in the UK. And certainly Craig would know the work of CLES very well, as would have been a sponsor for the work that they've done, that you've done there. And Neil McEnroy has been the chief executive of that group for quite a long time, and he's just retired or resigned from that position, but maintains a connection. And Sarah Longlands is the new chief executive, and will continue the work that CLES have been doing in the community wealth building space. And the reason why I'm talking about it is that I spent some time with CLES just prior to the COVID outbreak in Manchester in the UK, and our firm SGS Economics and Planning has an MOU with CLES to promote community wealth building and work and look for opportunities to work with them in community wealth building in Australia, in local economic development in Australia. So what is it? Well, it's a response to what I think many would agree is a broken, or at least partly broken, extractive economy that has concentrated wealth in too few hands. It's marginalised and alienated communities, and to be frank, it's wrought environmental destruction and near collapse to our ecosystem. So that's a broken economy in anyone's definition. So community wealth building is a response to that. It's a people-centred approach to local economic development, which looks to increase the flow of wealth back into local economies and places by giving more control to local people and business. So that's the definition that CLES have got there. So it's a maturing of the idea of economic development with a core focus of growing social and environmental benefits into all economic activity. And Neil McEnroy expresses this very eloquently, much better than I can, but he talks about how traditional economic development has focused on the idea of a redistribution after wealth has been created. So we talk about trickle-down economics as as something which will benefit the wider population over time, and we obviously have the idea of tax and transfer systems of the modern state, but they have been failing or aren't sufficient. And so as Neil talks about it in community wealth building as the pre-distribution during and before wealth is created. So community wealth building is about pre-distribution during and before wealth is created. CLES talk about the 5 pillars of community wealth building, and I'll briefly touch on each of these. So these can go in sort of any order, but if you like, the plural ownership of the economy might be seen as the overarching idea. So this is the idea of spreading wealth and democratising it by supporting small to medium-sized enterprise, local businesses, and encouraging a flourishing co-ops and employee-owned business sector. And those businesses are by definition rooted in local economies. Their wealth stays in local economies. And you've seen some moves around this, I suppose, after the 90s and early 2000s, the craze for outsourcing. Now you would see many places now starting to insource their services again, just thinking, well, we can have a local workforce which has been doing these activities. We can employ locals, and the wealth that's generated can stay local. So there's very much the idea of a plural and democratic economy at the heart of the idea of community wealth building. In the second one, making financial power work for local places, we all tuck away our savings, we all have our pensions, we all have our superannuation wealth, and often that, of course, goes all over the world. So this second idea is about somehow harnessing our own financial power, which is generated in local communities and in our savings, and making that redirected or redirecting it back to work for local places. The third one, fair employment and just labour markets. In general, in Australia, we've got reasonable industrial relations systems, but there are still obviously really deeply entrenched areas of disadvantage, of alienation from the workforce, and this is about trying to address those areas of disadvantage and give a hand up to people who are otherwise struggling to make it in the employment market. And And we'll talk a bit about anchor institutions, including on the next slide, but anchor institutions have an important role to show the way in terms of this fair employment idea. The fourth one there, progressive purchasing of goods and services. This is about ensuring that in the purchasing of goods and services, social, economic and environmental value is being maximised. And again, anchor institutions through their procurement practices can have a critical role in ensuring that they purchase socially fairly with environmental thoughts in mind, and that their work is creating a virtuous cycle of business development, spending and investment. And the last one, socially productive use of land and capital. Again, our major government institutions, the anchors within our communities, often they have significant land and property assets. The tendency is to occasionally flog those off for a highest and best use to add to the bottom line. They might be seen as being redundant assets or not being useful at this time. But this idea is about harnessing those land and assets for more socially productive outcomes. So, as I mentioned, anchor institutions are playing a critical role in the community wealth building agenda. And anchor institutions are those public and sometimes private organisations that are bound to or fixed in place. And they often have a special role as service providers in local communities. They're often funded via taxation or by government grants or government exchanges and transfers of wealth. And so these are significant spenders in the local economy. They're significant employers in the local economy. They're significant holders of land and assets in the local economy. So the expectation is that these anchors have a significant role in the community wealth building agenda. So just touching on where we're at in Australia, and a lot of the things that I've mentioned, if you're working in economic development, will sound familiar to you, and you might consider that your own economic development strategies or economic development strategies you've heard about are addressing one or some of the 5 pillars or all of the 5 pillars that I mentioned. And so let's think about the first one, this idea of a plural ownership of the economy. We've got a fantastic peak body called the Business Council of Co-ops and Mutuals. We've got an organisation called Employee Ownership Australia, and they're busy promoting the cooperative or employee-owned sector of the economy, really doing great work. But frankly, it's this idea of a plural economy, it's almost invisible in economic development strategies, and certainly in normal mainstream economic policy and federal government industry policy, for example. So there's much to be done in terms of promoting that particular pillar and agenda around it. Making financial power work for local places. I'd be really interested to hear what Craig's got to say about this and the initiatives that are happening in that space in the UK. But Australia actually does have a reasonably strong credit union sector and some community banking initiatives. Bendigo Bank in Victoria has small community banking branches, and they have quite an agenda of putting back in a small way profits that they make in local communities from local savings into local community enterprises and activities. So there is action in that space, but much more could be done, particularly, as I mentioned, around harnessing our superannuation for sustainable local community economic development. On the third one, fair employment and just labour markets, there'd be lots of examples of councils who are seeking to procure socially and with the idea of a fair outcome. And I've got an example there just from the City of Melton in Western Melbourne. They have a program called Given the Chance of supporting disadvantaged job seekers. But again, there would be much more. And actually, I've got another highlight there, the Victoria Social Procurement Framework. So that's a state government initiative which is about a share of the capital spend being about securing work for Indigenous people and disadvantaged people and disabled people in particular. So that's beginning to appear in at state government level. And on progressive purchasing of goods and services, a lot of councils have what you would call buy local policies. That's the emblem from the Gold Coast, which has a very prominent buy local policy. So there are lots of examples of buy local. Grow Bendigo is another example where there's buy local promotion. I think there's weaknesses in those approaches because they don't look enough at the supply side. So again, there's more work to be done in that space. Socially productive land and property, we are seeing, some dedication of public land, for example, to affordable housing projects. But as I say, there has been a tendency to not think very systematically or holistically around ownership and assets. And so there's plenty more to be done in that space. So that's just an overview, Chris. Hope it gives you a little bit of a flavour. I would say, just in concluding, that I do think we're yet to see a council, for example, in Australia, really embrace community wealth building in a comprehensive way. And I'm sure Monica will be heading in that direction because everything the City of Sydney does, they do with gusto. So I look forward to hear what Monica's doing. But I would see it's mostly seen as a sort of an add-on to economic development, not as a holistic or comprehensive approach yet.
I was going to ask you that question, Pat. We can perhaps explore that in just a little while. I would remind people, as Catherine has done in the chat, that we will be taking audience Q&A. So please help us by capturing those questions as they come to you, pop them in the chat, and we'll have open Q&A after we hear the presentations. Pat, just very quickly on that last slide, most of those examples, correct me if I'm wrong, were from Victoria. What does that say about the rest of Australia in terms of embracing the principles of community wealth being, or have you deliberately chosen those examples?
Look, they're probably the ones top of mind to me, which is where I am, and certainly, Queensland and Western Australia with their and South Australia with their very strong independent traditions would have quite strong buy local purchasing, probably all the way down to local governments. And I certainly know even in the creative sector in South Australia, my partner works in the creative sector, and she'd like to get more work in the Adelaide market. But there's a sort of a go-to South Australians first type approach in the theatre sector there, for example. So yeah, look, I think there are there's patchy efforts all around the country. And I do think Victoria as a government, the Victorian government is starting to move a bit more progressively in this space and more systematically, but it's still not, mainstream. It's still, I think, an add-on rather than a holistic approach around economic development.
All right, I suspect some reasons behind that. People will be looking for more on that in the questions as we move through the session. But thank you,
I've got
Pat.
a few thoughts on that, so I'll come back to those. Yep.
Excellent. All right, take a breath and we'll move on to Craig Hatton, CEO of North Ayrshire Council in Scotland, the first community wealth building council in Scotland. Really keen to hear how you've come to carry that mantle, Craig. Your slides are up, so please take it away and tell us all about your experience with community wealth building.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I think Pat made a really important point there about community wealth building. Is it just an add-on to economic development, or is it actually at the heart of everything you do? And for us as a council, it's at the heart of everything we do. It's a cultural change about being community wealth building. And I'll speak around some of that as I go through the presentation this morning. So North Ayrshire itself, situated on the west coast of Scotland, 25 miles southwest of Glasgow. And obviously we've got COP26 coming in a few months, and we're all really excited about that, to bring that national focus to climate change. We have a population of around 135,000 people, covering the mainland, and we've got 3 islands, one of which is uninhabited. So, clearly a very diverse rural and urban mix there. We have a range of challenges, social, economic and environmental, in North Ayrshire. And you can see from the slide there, a quarter of our children live in poverty, and we've got really high levels of unemployment and low job density. So 1 job for every 2 people. So I think it's fair to say we have a number of challenges. We also declared a climate change emergency in 2019, and I'll be using technology later on this evening at 6:30 UK time when we are launching our 3rd climate change and environmental sustainability strategy on Facebook Live. So if anybody wants to dial into that, please do. I think for us, we were suffering with all that, and it was very, very clear that the traditional models of economic development simply aren't working for North Ayrshire. They're just not making a difference, and we needed something radical, something different. So our wealth building journey, what is our aim? Well, we want an inclusive well-being economy in North Ayrshire. We want economic development, economic investment to filter through to everybody. So everybody within North Ayrshire benefits from the economic activity in the area, because we think that is the best way of getting people to have more enjoyable lives, healthier lives, longer lives, and create a true community spirit. And we saw lots and lots of that coming through in our initial response to the pandemic, where the response of the community was quite literally off the scale. In 2019, we worked with CLES, and Pat has spoken around CLES and developed a community wealth building diagnostic, and that's informed the development of our strategy. We also established a commission to collaborate with regional anchor institutions, and Pat spoke a little bit around those, you know, the police, the health board, range of local partners there, and reaching out more and more into the private sector. And as I said, it needs to be at the heart of what you do and not an add-on. And we devised a new strategic plan, our new business plan for the 5-year period. In 2019, the council plan, and community wealth building is absolutely at the heart of that. And in May 2020, we engaged with council staff and citizens across our 6 locality areas and developed our strategy. And it's very much around a bottom-up approach. We are a council that doesn't do things to people, we do things with people. And I think that's really important. And with that launch of that strategy, which again was during the pandemic, we became the first community wealth building council in Scotland. So we have a mission focused on enhancing local wealth and creation of fair jobs and maximising the potential of all our places through working in partnership with our communities and businesses, you know, working with, not doing to. And Steve has spoken around, Pat has spoken around the 5 pillars that you can see there. But importantly, that council-wide approach, working across all services with local and regional partners to achieve social, economic and environmental well-being, and climate action cuts across almost all of our pillars with a drive to create an economy which works for people and the planet. So how are we delivering community wealth building? Well, the key to it is about collaboration. I've spoke about working with businesses and local communities, and the wider, what we term and what CLES term as regional anchor institutions. We cannot do this alone. We need to do it with the other partners, the other agencies, the public agencies, who probably the biggest landowners in the area, have more of the spend than any other institution in the area, and that is the only way that we can achieve that long-term transformational change that we're looking at. As part of delivering community wealth building, we have to invest. So we invested in 10 new members of staff to support our wealth building journey and embed those across council services to support this new approach. So we've got 3 new business locality officers to support businesses to tender. And again, Pat mentioned around, some people say, oh, we buy local. But if businesses can't deliver or develop the product, the skills to procure, to bid for council contracts, then nothing's going to change. You've got to work with businesses. This is not about giving contracts to local businesses just because they're local. It's not about that, because that's unsustainable. You have to make those businesses strong, resilient, able to deliver the goods that you want and services you want to procure, and that puts them in a stronger position and a more sustainable position, and it's not subsidizing. And that's really key to this in my mind. So we really focus on that route, you know, how do we get down to the bottom level and then it comes up. So that's really important around the procurement, because lots of people say, oh, we're doing community wealth building, we buy X amount of goods locally. Well, you may do, but that wealth may just go out the area, and that's not what wealth building is around. In November 2020, we signed a £250 million Ayrshire growth deal with 2 other Ayrshire councils in UK and Scottish government, which gives a much needed boost for the region. And that will be, I suppose, really a real test of that broader delivery of community wealth building. And also as part of that, we've got a community wealth building fund of £3 million pan-Ayrshire to develop that regional approach. So we're looking to spread this a little bit wider across Ayrshire. The other 2 Ayrshire councils are roughly the same size as ourselves, just slightly smaller, but roughly the same size. So you're looking at 400,000 population, and each one will spend a net revenue budget of about £300 million. And if we talk about that procurement piece, North Ayrshire spends roughly £200 million a year externally. And what I mean by externally is purchasing goods, services. So that might be bricks for new homes that we're building, or it might be pens that we use in the office. You know, it really is that broad spread, but we spend around £200 million on that work. I spoke around the anchor charters, the anchor organisations, and what was really key for us was to get the partners to agree and sit on our community wealth building commission. So that's got representatives across all local partners. So the 3 councils, the NHS, police, fire and rescue, college, third sector, Scottish Enterprise, who are the national economic agency that work into government, and our health and social care partnership. So we've got all those partners round the table, all contributing, but importantly, all committing to community wealth building principles and moving forward. Whilst I think we're in a really good place, we're just at the start of this journey if we're going to deliver that transformational change. And we also have a number of lead officers working groups, because it's easy to have talking shops. It's got to be action on the ground. And we set out 3 initial work streams around procurement, around fair employment, and around land and assets. And some of that work is coming through really well. And I'll give some examples in a little short while around that. But the Anchor Charter commits signatories to pledges across all 5 pillars. And we've also developed a 6th pillar, which is a cross-cutting pillar of climate action. So we've got 7 commission members signed up to the charter: the councils, NHS, the college, Scottish Enterprise, the Ayrshire Community Trust, who are the third sector interface. So they're all signed up and committed. So it's not by people coming to a meeting and then going away and doing nothing. They're actual signatories and commit this. And the commission as a whole holds each one to account. So community wealth building in action, some of the things that we've done. I touched on procurement earlier, and I spoke around that £200 million. And I think we were 2 years ago, we were spending about 17% locally. We've got a target to increase that to 26% locally. So if we achieve that, that'll be over £50 million that the council spends, which is reinvested in its own area with local suppliers. And I think that is really important, provided that we can get that link, that they then have fair employment practices, and we get that trickle through, which is bigger and different from the traditional model, where does that trickle through occur? Does it go out with the area? So lots and lots of work around that, as I spoke around. We have 2 landfill sites, former landfill sites, now closed. That land, you know, usually just left to one side and basically just maintaining the area. We've got agreed business cases, and we're pressing forward with putting 2 PV solar farms on that land, and hopefully they will be up and running towards the end of next year. So we're using land that is vacant, we're using it in a positive way. We'll use it to generate local income, and as part of our renewable policies, 15% of the profit goes to our community investment fund, where local communities decide how that money is spent on local projects that they're key stakeholders in. So we're really having that, again, that trickle through of investment. And of course, the climate emergency, it's really important that we do those sort of work. Lockshaw. So Lockshaw is a formal steelworks, vacant, derelict, contaminated. It's got a lake in the middle. It's a fantastic opportunity there. So we're looking at redevelopment of that regeneration through that wealth building lens, and it will contribute to all 5 pillars. So major tourism and leisure destination will have leisure uses, play facilities, active travel routes, tree planting, really important, habitat creation, and whilst creating the conditions within the site for future housing development. So we're looking at a range of users there to bring this derelict site back into use in a very, very positive way, but where all the community and the climate can benefit. So I've given a quick run through there. There's so many initiatives. I could talk forever around this subject. It's something that I'm really passionate around, but the whole council is really passionate about. People get it, and that's really important. But what are the lessons from our journey? It's important you have that plan, do, check, act cycle always. So what I would say and what we would say is about setting a vision that is clear and ambitious, but practical. You've got to get buy-in. We see too many plans, strategies that are written, launched, put on a shelf, nothing ever happens. The anchor institutions, education, talking to people and working in collaboration. It takes time. People are really, really busy dealing with what I would call the day-to-day job. And if you're going to achieve that fundamental shift, you need to take the time and you need to work across the silos that do exist. You know, we would like to think there's no silos, but in reality, we know there are. How we can stride across those and come together. You just have to rethink the way we traditionally do things. And I often talk with my team around culture. This is the way we do things around here. And that's with wealth building. This is the new way that we do things around here. Build that awareness, build that buy-in, but importantly, show quick wins so people can see that in action. I think that's really, really important. I spoke around bottom-up engagement and place-based resource investment. You can't just have a strategy and not put the money behind it to help deliver that change, you know, working with businesses, identifying land assets, looking at plural ownership and challenging feedback. You know, everybody probably thinks, oh, we're doing the right thing and off we go in the journey, but it's really important that you challenge, particularly about something new. So we have a wealth building expert advisory panel, which is chaired by the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And that is really important to us. And what we do with that advisory panel, we put all our strategies and policies past them. So they look at it and challenge us through that wealth building lens. And that's what we did with the environmental strategy that we're launching tonight, the third cycle of that work, to get that feedback and get that important input to keep us honest and make sure that we are not straying from those values. But also it brings experience from elsewhere.
That was fabulous, Craig. Thank you very much. Can I just check, you're the first community wealth building council in Scotland. Am I right that there's now a national imperative from your national government that all councils start to embrace this model?
Yes, so Scottish government, a new government elected in May, just gone by. So they are developing a Community Wealth Building Act. There will be I think there's going to be a Minister for Community Wealth Building. So, you know, that's got that national imperative now, which is really important, but wealth building is about local delivery. And that's an important part to consider. And I'll just say one more thing just while I'm on. So Pat spoke around financial power, and we've looked a lot at a community bank, but we aren't big enough. But that's something we see developing more on a national level. Scotland's got a population just over 5 million. We think that can sustain 2 community banks, and that would be ideal. But North Ayrshire at 135,000 can't deliver a community bank alone. So it's about focusing the right things at the right level, I would say.
I was just thinking you're going to be in demand from all those other councils that want to know how to get started, because you're partway there. So I'm sure that's already starting to be experienced.
Well, yes, I mean, lots of councils making lots of advances. It's really, really good to see, really, really good to see. And obviously that national interest, and Neil from CLES that, again, Pat referred to earlier, have been doing some work with Scottish government prior to the election, and that work continues. So it's really, really good to see.
Fabulous. Thank you, Craig. Take a breath and we'll come back to you for some questions. There's quite a few questions coming in, and as you'd expect, questions about buy-in and resistance and barriers, etc. A bit of a theme coming through there. So we'll try and unpack some of that with our panelists shortly. But I want to bring on Monica Barone now, CEO of the City of Sydney. Have you been taking lots of notes during all of that, Monica?
I certainly have.
I thought you might, because you're just starting on the journey, aren't you? Here come your slides.
We are.
Take it away and tell us a bit about the Sydney experience.
Thank you. So yes, I'm going to just say a few words about how we're starting this journey, but also, about how we're thinking about how to embed community wealth building across our organisation. But I have to say, just before I begin, that we were very inspired by the work that Pat Fensham did and the paper that he wrote and summarised in his presentation today that really clearly, describes the framework. And I have to say, Craig, listening to your presentation, I really thought a lot about the issue of the governance that you put around something like embedding community wealth building. So thank you for those insights. Because, of course, we've got people from both Scotland, the UK and Australia, I'm just going to set the scene a little bit just to tell you a little bit about the City of Sydney. So the City of Sydney is one of 33 councils that cover metropolitan Sydney, and metropolitan Sydney has a population of about 5.5 million. So even though, we are probably the largest and most financially kind of viable of those councils, but nevertheless, we're just one of 33. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as both an impediment and as opportunity as we go along. When the Lord Mayor Clovermore was elected in 2004, we set about writing a new vision for the City of Sydney. And we engaged actually SGS Economics, who brought together a fabulous consortium and helped us to write Sustainable Sydney 2030. And that's the overarching document that we still use, although we are obviously continuously refreshing it because now 2030 is not a very long horizon. That document is the document that sets the overarching vision, targets and actions that guide everything we do at the City of Sydney. Obviously, sitting underneath that document, though, there are a series of other documents that then give the detail. They're the kind of action plans and they're linked to the, to the budget, which demonstrate to the community and outline how we're going to achieve those targets and objectives in Sustainable Sydney 2030. And I'll just mention three because it's within these documents that the opportunities for community wealth building are actually already housed. So obviously the waste strategy determines what we're going to do in the space of dealing with waste and sets those targets. The environment strategy we review every 4 years because we set the new increments for the council for that term of council, and it determines what we're going to achieve within the 4 years towards that larger target. The reconciliation action plan, though, is a very important one in this discussion because it very explicit, it is already a place-based plan about a particular community. Now, for those of you that are not from Australia, developing the Reconciliation Action Plan methodology is a national methodology that organisations use to outline how they will meet the needs of their Indigenous communities. And that methodology is overseen by a national body. And the Stretch Reconciliation Plan is the third of the 4 steps that you can move along. Now, it already asks you to commit to things like fair employment and opportunity, to procurement and to business development. So already some of those elements that eventually will sit within our larger community wealth building policy at the City of Sydney are already within these documents. The other thing I would say is that even though, until recently we haven't had a community wealth building framework, and in fact we're only commencing on that journey, many of the things that are described in community wealth building are things that the City of Sydney already does because of these documents. So, for example, we already have, about 110 of our community buildings provided for nothing or subsidised to support community organisations and business development. We've already sold all of our surplus land at a discount for affordable housing. We already use procurement to drive local and environmental outcomes, which I'm going to share with you in a moment. And we already have a big focus on fair employment. And one of our greatest successes has been our gender pay gap. We report gender pay gap in Australia. I think we're the only local government that joins into the national survey. And the City of Sydney is proud to say that we now have a gender pay gap in favour of women, 7% in favour of women, whereas in Australia, the gender pay gap in the public sector is usually 12% in favour of men. So we're already achieving some of these things, but we're not achieving them under a clear and explicit framework. So last year, our Deputy Lord Mayor asked us to consider creating this explicit framework and embedding that in our new 2050 plan, which is the refresh of the 2030 plan. And when we looked at it, I have to say we were really quite excited about it because it provided a very neat framework that already it helped to enhance what we were doing, but most importantly, it makes what we're doing very explicit and drives it to a particular, drives the purpose much more clearly. And one of the things I've been saying when I've been talking to the organisation and to others about community wealth building is that it both determines what we will do in order to achieve community wealth, but it also helps to describe how we will conduct ourselves. And I think that's a really important thing that governments or local governments need to say and do explicitly. So we used this SGS paper to guide the development of this discussion paper. The discussion paper is now out on exhibition. And what we will eventually do is weave it into all of our plans, the ones that I've shown you and the ones that, and as those plans are refreshed, we will weave those into our plans and make it one of the overarching frameworks that guides the things that we do at the City of Sydney. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we're already starting to do this in the procurement area. Even though we don't yet have an overarching community wealth building framework and policy that's embedded in everything we do, we are already achieving some of those things, as I've said. We already have a sustainable procurement policy. And I know that procurement is only one of the pillars, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about it. And this policy already influences how we work with our contractors, how we procure. And as a consequence of this, all of our tender documents now include the schedules that guide our contractors and the people that provide us, that we purchase services for, towards helping us achieve the objectives that the community and the council have determined are the most important. I'll just show you some of those examples. So we have a program called the Strategic Contracts Program, and these are the large contracts that contract managers have to report these results. All of these contracts are reported directly to executive to ensure that we are getting the results from these contracts that we desire. And these, you can see if you read down the side, how we've already required these large contracts to deliver against those objectives. So for example, sustainability speaks to the environmental strategy that I've shown you. So people have to demonstrate how they help achieve those environmental and waste objectives that the council is seeking. The First Nations people speaks to our Reconciliation Action Plan. So contractors have to report on Indigenous employment, social inclusion for other disadvantaged groups, local buy, how they are using their procurement and their subcontracting to help us achieve those objectives, and so on. So this is our parks maintenance contract, and the civil works contract has much the same. I just want to say one thing about the relationship between this and the Reconciliation Action Plan, because one of the ways, the beauty of all of these things coming together in the way that they do is that because we have a Reconciliation Action Plan and we have a national methodology for this, when we ask our contractors to deliver against objectives that support our Indigenous communities, one of the ways that we know whether they are credible suppliers is if they have reconciliation action plans, right? So if they do, we're able to know that they have already made a commitment to certain, to those objectives, and they've already made a certain commitment to conduct themselves as a business in accordance with the objectives of reconciliation action, right? And so you can see how, having that system enables us to have a kind of an assurance from our suppliers that they too share those values. I mentioned that there are 33 councils that make up Metropolitan Sydney, and one of the pieces of work that we've been doing over the last 5 years is developing the Resilient Sydney, is running Resilient Sydney. So 5 years ago, Sydney became one of the Rockefeller 100 resilient cities. Now, the City of Sydney hosts that office. And what we do through that office is actually collaborate with all 33 councils. And that collaboration is what is going to lead to us being able to really join up our activities, and including and especially our procurement power. So as a consequence of that collaboration, we now, all 33 councils of Sydney, use the same resilience platform, and that resilience platform gives all of those councils their water, waste and emissions data. And now we're adding canopy data, we're trying to add green power data and so forth, right? But the value of that is that we're able to have evidence-based decisions and discussions about setting targets. And the setting of targets is a real prerequisite to being able to procure together or to act together. And can I say, as a consequence of this sort of collaboration, we've had some really great achievements in recent years. So by working together, there are 29 councils now that have all procured LED street lights. So there are 230,000 street lights across metropolitan Sydney, and together we've now replaced 150,000 of those, reduced emissions by 79% from street lights, and saved those councils $5.5 million a year. Recently, 16 of us have joined together and procured road resheeting that has a greater amount of recycled glass in it. Now, this is glass that cannot be turned back into glass. It's ending up in landfill. But because we agreed on the road resheeting recipe, we were able to procure together that supply. And we think we have now taken up all of the glass that we would normally have put into landfill. And finally, there are about, when the City of Sydney went out to buy its renewable electricity, because we did not have the same renewable electricity target as other councils, we couldn't buy with them because we wanted 100% and the others didn't. But now there are about 21 councils working together to buy renewable electricity. So this is about working again in partnership with other organisations, in this case councils, to align what we are trying to achieve, align targets so that we can then get some of those results. Thank you.
We've had quite a few questions about the topic. We're also getting questions about whether the slides will be made available, and yes, they will, along with the link to the recording of this when it's available in a day or two. Monica, one thing, and I think this has come up in some of the questions too, that exercises my mind about all this when you start talking about local, particularly in your context of a greater metropolitan area. How do you define that? What does that mean to the City of Sydney?
Well, I think there's a bit of work to be done there, right? So we did an audit on where we were purchasing, and we discovered that about 40 to 50% of what we were purchasing was from organisations that were headquartered in our local government area, and about 30% was within the ring of councils around us. So, but that's not fine-grained enough information, is it? That tells you that those businesses are headquartered there, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how those businesses are conducting themselves, where those profits go, and whether they have the same values as you towards committed to local people, committed to local investment, those kinds of things. So there's work to be done there. So one of the things we're talking, though, about is that there's the concept of local, but there's also the concept of purpose. So, you know, if an organisation may not be headquartered or have their business within our local government area, but their purpose, right? For example, the people we buy our renewable electricity from do not have their solar farm in our local government area, but they do have it in partnership with other councils in rural areas who benefit from that income and from that investment and from those jobs. So getting that benefit, place-based is important, but purpose is also important. And that comes from interrogating. So of course, when we went out to tender for our renewable electricity, we specified that we would prefer to buy from a community-based provider that was going to keep those jobs and that investment in the community where that infrastructure was housed.
I wonder whether
Chris,
Craig might want to add something to that. Yes, before we go to audience.
Yeah, I will add something. I mean, I saw a few questions in the chat there about, is this, protectionist and all this sort of stuff. And I agree completely with Monica. The idea of local is less important than the idea of values and of purpose. And I think if you get enough of the value criteria right, almost as Monica's implying, you'll end up with a version of local anyway. I think that's the challenge. And as Monica's pointed out, an address isn't sufficient. There was even a question about what is local and isn't an address. And I know, Craig, I'm not sure whether you're doing any of this, but I know that Claire's are working with a lot of their clients to actually chase the value chain down, as Monica's implied there. It's not just the first sale. It's about where that firm might be employing, what its practices are in employment, where it purchases goods from. So there's a virtuous cycle going on there. So there's more work to be done in that area. And one of the things which I think a higher level of government would do, I mean, Monica's outlined the fact that they've crafted a whole bunch of criteria in their procurement, which is a fair bit of work, and also a fair bit of work for a seller to respond to. One of the things which would happen, I think, if you had community wealth building embraced more at, say, the state level or the federal level, is you might end up with, quite stronger certification around suppliers. So that they're actually, they've got to prove the fact that they've got a reconciliation plan, that they employ fairly, that they do no environmental harm, etc., etc. And then instead of Monica having to do all the cross checks and the due diligence, that firm is ready to go and already pre-qualified, if you like, to satisfy their procurement needs.
Great, Pat. Craig, anything to add from your perspective?
No, I would say that values is absolutely right. So, for example, at the moment, we'll shortly be procuring a £60 million community campus. So we know that will be from a national organisation, perhaps international organisation, but it's what are the values that they've got, and how do they filter down to the local economy through supply chains, through local employment of contractors during this build. So it is around making sure people have got the values. But the key for us is about ensuring our local businesses have the right support, the right values, so that when they're procuring out with the area, outside of North Ayrshire, they are still in a really good place to do that. And those values filter wider and wider and wider across Scotland.
So I might say, one of the documents I didn't talk about is our Era Journey Economic Development Strategy. So we also have sitting alongside things like that, which are strategies which are about supporting our local Indigenous businesses to grow so that they can compete. I think that's what Craig's talking about. We're one of the first organisations in Sydney to join Supply Nation, which is the Indigenous Supplier kind of council. And we very proactively have worked with those businesses to support them to become competitive, to train them and how to tender at the City of Sydney. So all of these things, you have to do all of these things. And I think Craig's referring to that. That's such an important part of it. Having confidence in your local people and believing in their ability to build up their own businesses so that in time they can just compete like anyone else.
We've got about 15, 20 minutes, no more left, and an embarrassment of riches, Catherine, with questions in the chat and even some people with their hands up. So over to you to moderate this next section.
Yeah, look, thank you, Chris. And there are quite a number of questions, as we would have expected to, hearing those amazing presentations. Look, we'll go back to the beginning of the questions, I think, and we have one here asking what have been the biggest challenges and obstacles in rolling out community wealth building, and what kind of objections have come up and how have you overcome them? I suppose this is one for Craig.
Thank you for that question. So I think in the slides, the importance of setting the vision around getting partners on board, speaking with partners, and it's about changing the culture, the way we do things around here. Things are now, we want to do things a different way because the traditional models aren't working for us. And certainly with some of the national organisations who have central procurement functions, you know, for example, or land and assets that are controlled centrally rather than locally, they are some of the biggest challenges. So what we've done in those instances is reach out to the national centre. So for example, working with the Chief Constable and getting his commitment, the Chief Constable for Scotland, his commitment to this different way of working and allowing some local flexibility within their frameworks, but also driving that change or explaining what we are trying to achieve so they alter their approach or review their approach nationally, then everyone across Scotland benefits. So I think that's one thing. It's easy to look at this as protectionism. It absolutely is not protectionism. You know, it absolutely isn't. And if people think it is, then they don't grasp it. This is about making things stronger and using the resources and assets that initially we have in the public sector to create that fairer economy. And that's, if I just talk around procurement, and that's why we've employed people to go and work with local businesses to develop their offer. Develop, this is what we are looking for, but this is what nationally, because, you know, there's going to be a National Community Wealth Building Act coming through. So you're up there on the front foot early on. So there's some of the things, just winning over those hearts and minds. But the clear thing is you need to show results from this. And a couple of weeks ago, we created an inclusive growth diagnostic and action plan, and that's available on our website. And there's a range of measures how we will measure the success of this work or the progress that we're making.
You've answered a few of the other questions that have come through about how do you get that buy-in, that community buy-in, and why it's important. So perhaps I'll move on to another question, which was, I guess, a really practical one. How do you persuade small businesses to adopt fair employment practices? Has there been much resistance to that? I'm not sure who can answer that question on the panel.
So I don't think there's been, I think a lot of local businesses, small businesses, are frustrated with bureaucratic procurement processes. You know, the public sector are the kings of bureaucracy, aren't we? We make a lot of ourselves, and one of my sort of aims is to cut through that whilst making sure we've got the right safeguards in place. So we go out, we engage with local businesses, we talk about the help they can get free of charge from the council that will help develop their business. We have a procurement wave plan, so we're having that forward look and say, these are the contracts we've got coming up that we will be tendering for. We know this is your area of work. Is that something you would be? But as part of that, we have these principles around fair employment that we feed in to our procurement frameworks. Now there is some legal barriers to overcome, so it's very important that you frame that correctly. But it's about working in partnership with businesses, explaining the principles, explaining the benefits. We haven't had anybody push back yet in terms of that, because if the engagement and the points of discussion are right, people will understand what we're trying to achieve.
I mean, I think one of the things, I don't know if this is the same in the UK, but COVID really exposed the issue about people in the kind of gig economy or, you know, with insecure work. So when COVID hit, the first lockdown happened in Sydney, you know, many of the students, international students, people on visas, a whole lot of people were not eligible for the benefits that were available to people. I mean, one of the first things we had to do was put literally, you know, immediately $2 million just into food services, and we coordinated 60 organisations that, you know, we've got relationships with, thankfully, to come together to be able to just provide food to people. I think, you know, we've been dealing with that in our own organisation. Like, we have been working very hard to get rid of, you know, things like casuals and any temporary employment and those kinds of things. We will always have some contingent labour. We will always have some, you know, seasonal kind of work, but we've really made the commitment to permanent jobs with benefits. I guess what I'm saying is, though, that, you know, for many small businesses, that's really very, very difficult in our kind of industrial environment in this country. And I think people are really asking themselves now what they think about that. You know, if your children can't get a permanent job, they will never get a loan. It's hard enough to get a house, but you'll never get a house if you can't get a loan.
Yeah, look, just one little thing, just on the sort of practicalities of it, and Craig's alluded to it, but his organisation will have done a hell of a lot of work looking at its spend, disaggregating it, you know, so in terms of how do you invite local businesses in, how do you engage with local businesses, it isn't just a matter of a buy local policy. That's actually contrary to good practice. You know, what Craig's group will have done, and what Preston Council in the UK have done, what other groups have done, is actually forensically examine their spend and say, okay, what is out of the question? We're going to have to procure externally. You know, this is too specialist. We're not going to be able to offer this to locals. But what is within the realm of spend, which we do locally, or which we could do locally? And typically, you know, a council will have a pretty lazy procurement policy, which will be highest and best value, you know, blah blah, and that's sort of it. You know, so that's not going to provide a window for a local supplier at all until you start thinking, well, okay, how do we procure? Can we break up our procurement practices? How can we engage? How can we publicise the opportunities? How can we think differently about procuring in bulk? Still getting value. We're not trying to give away, you know, not trying to do things more expensively. So that's on the anchor institution side of the ledger, is actually doing the work to actually break up and understand the spend in a way that is then communicatable to the local small business base. And as Craig says, there's a lot of, on the supply side, working with those businesses to make sure they're able to get a look in. And Craig's absolutely right. You know, there's bunches of small business in Australia who wouldn't go near local government contracts because it's just too much hard work. It's just too cumbersome. And so there's a lot of work to be done on both sides.
Marianne, I know you've got your hand up, and others, please feel free in the room to put your hand up if you've got a question also. Marianne, over to you.
I'm from England, from the UK, from the West Midlands, and I work in community development. I'm just trying to see the added value that you can look at in relation to, we talk about assets and we talk about people. The normal person on the street is going to benefit from this, but in terms of them moving forward themselves and how you couple this with supporting people, individual families and people, a programme that helps people to help themselves. Often people who live in poorer areas can't articulate themselves, can't know how some of this stuff affects their lives and how they get the confidence to be able to change things in their own lives. So, for example, if somebody needs to complain, example, to their school because they don't think their children's getting the right education, what provision or additions can you do to capacity build residents to be able to get some personalisation of helping them to take control and articulate themselves and move themselves through the system to be able to benefit from the things that you're doing, but also in terms of cost effectiveness, be able to help them to help themselves?
One of the projects that we've embarked on is based on the Detroit Food Lab. So that the Detroit Food Lab started in Detroit when things, when basically things got so bad in Detroit that there were no longer even any supermarkets. This is how they describe it to me. And the only place people could buy food were like petrol stations. So the food supply and the quality of the food supply was really, really diminished. And it was a huge kind of community movement to help people to start community gardens and to grow food and to learn to cook food and produce food for their own community and then start small businesses and so on and so forth. So this can work in so many different levels, and it depends on the needs of your community. And I think that's why you're important, Marianne, what you're saying is so important, and why local government is so well placed to do this, because each local government has to look at the circumstances of their community and say, how can I use these principles which is about place-based economic justice. How can we use these principles in the way that suits and meets the needs of our community? So in some community, and so you've described a community where that economic justice, those programs may need to be very grassroots about, maybe you're talking about programs of small loans, as those micro loan type programs have happened in other parts of the world. So each organization, each council, each has to understand its local community and its needs, but I think it is applicable. It's how it's designed.
Just one thing, a sort of more general point, but it picks up on Marianne's heartfelt plea for empowerment for people who are disadvantaged or who aren't part of the system. One of the things that SGS talks about much more these days is the idea of community as the third pillar within economic development strategy. So the first is government and markets are the second pillar, but community, we've lost sight of the role of community there. That's the glue. That's the glue. That's where the trust-based relationships are. That's where the faith is. That's where the volunteer sector is. That's where the heart and soul of an economy is around its community. And of course, we have lost sight of that. And so anything in economic development now really needs to re-engineer and re-find a place for community as part of a strategy.
Thanks, Pat. And I think that's probably a good segue into the next question, which is a question about, the buy-in or getting that commitment from the elected representatives to support and get behind this concept of community wealth building. I know in the UK, you have significantly more elected representatives with your organisation, your council, than we do here. Craig, how many elected reps do you have?
So we have 33 elected councillors. So if perhaps if I just jump
33.
talk a little bit around that. I mean, part of the thing is around local democracy. I mean, so people know, and there's a greater how Scotland works its elected members, deprivation's taken into account because there's more casework, for example. But in terms of elected member engagement, it could easily have been the leader of the council sitting here instead of me this morning. We both do a number of presentations. Councillor Joe Cullen and the leader of North Ayrshire Council is absolutely foursquare behind this. He's really one of the great pioneers and drives this initiative at the council. And he goes off and does presentations and brings in partners. He does a hell of a lot of work around it. So we absolutely have that political buy-in, but also it is cross-council. I think it's fair to say we are very clear about taking our strategies forward, getting council approval for these, all been supported. We're all moving forward because as a council, we recognise we just need to do something different because the level of poverty, the level of deprivation, the level of unemployment is quite frankly not acceptable for us, that a council that's ambitious for our communities.
Thanks, Craig. And Monica, I know you also mentioned the Mayor of Sydney, Clover Moore. How important do you think it was to have her supporting this strategy?
Well, we do have a very sort of socially minded and climate action committed council. So we've got a very receptive council to these ideas. Well, you can't really do anything without their support. So I think, it depends on the nature of your council, how you pitch and design these things. I think you'd be very hard pressed to find an elected representative that doesn't care about local business or local jobs. These are just, of course people care about local business and local jobs. Of course people want their constituents to have, economic security. So again, it's the narrative that you put around it is going to be based on the nature of the community and the elected representatives. But I can't imagine meeting someone who says, no, I'd rather really invest in businesses that bring their marketing office to Sydney and then don't pay tax in Australia. Yes, I'm all for that. You're not going to meet many people who think that's a good way to go.
Chris and Catherine, I've got an opinion that it's actually not the politicians that are the problem, it's the bureaucrats in terms of this agenda. I think Monica is absolutely right. If enough of this messaging gets through to enough local politicians, there'll be a wave of community wealth building action. And I'm actually, you know, I'm a consultant and I pitch for local economic development strategies, and I've been doing quite a bit of it since I returned from the UK a couple of years ago. And there has been an uptick in economic development strategy work post-COVID, but I am surprised at how little knowledge there is of community wealth building amongst practitioners. I'm surprised at how little explicit reference there is in briefs to community wealth building, prospects for community wealth building. So what I'm observing in local councils, or at least amongst briefs for economic development strategies, is more or less business as usual, you know. So we want an investment attraction strategy, we want a branding strategy, we want a marketing strategy, we want to look at our competitive and comparative advantage and see how we stack up and all the rest of it. And that's fine to an extent, but honestly, there's so many regions in Australia who don't have a great scorecard when it comes to identifying things that are going to attract inward investment or distinguishing themselves by their comparative or competitive advantage. You know, so community wealth building flips it on its head, because it says we've got wealth in our community, we've got anchor institutions, we've got inherited wealth. There's a lot of wealth in community, particularly in Australia. We're a wealthy country. You know, how do we make that work better for locals? And I think there's again, what we're encountering to some extent is the norms amongst bureaucrats, amongst economic development practitioners who have always done it one way, who see it as too hard to engage with procurement, with community services, with, you know, a whole bunch of other arms of council. So I suspect, if we go back to Craig, the question might be, well, actually you need political leadership, and it's likely to be, you know, this agenda and this push has more chance if the leadership and political leadership is on board and knows about it. And of course, that's the role of someone like a Monica or a Craig to actually alert their politician partners to the possibilities and prospects.
Pat, just taking the Scotland example that Craig was talking about, is there a role for more involvement, more awareness raising at the state and federal government level? Because it seems like local councils are just doing what they've always done and don't really know about these concepts yet.
No, I think, yeah, look, I would love it if it was part of the language of state governments. You know, I think it would change the paradigm big time. And as we know, in Britain, local governments are a bit more powerful, you know, so there's networks of I mean, they have a lot of power around housing, around education, so they're sort of in a position to run with the agenda a little bit harder perhaps than some of the councils, some local councils in Australia. That, not to say that the councils couldn't run with the agenda, but I think I'd love to see, yeah, more explicit policy action at state level. I'm not holding my breath for the federal level in this country, but at state level at least, this is a natural agenda which, you know, both sides of politics I think can run with.
I'm sorry, we've run out of time, and I know there's some more questions there. It's always nice to have more questions than we have time, but I know that's a bit frustrating for people as well. Catherine, any final words to sum up before I thank our panel members?
Look, Chris, I would just like to thank the panel members also, but also for the participants and for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but as Chris indicated, we will be sharing the slides and also a video of tonight's session. So you'll be able to, you know, rewind it and pause and go back and take notes if you've missed anything. Pat, I think picking up on your point, it's just a terrific opportunity that the VLGA has had together with LGIU to, I guess, commence the discussion in more detail here in Australia. And, you know, perhaps there's some future live panel discussions on the agenda, given the amount of interest and also how new this concept is as a strategy, or the term community wealth building as you've described. So Chris, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you to all of our attendees for being here and for those lovely comments that are coming through in the chat room as you depart. Can I just finally thank, firstly, Pat Fensham from SGS Economics and Planning for setting the scene on community wealth building. Thank you, Pat.
Thanks,
Craig
Chris.
Hatton, at the start of your day there in Scotland, taking us on the Scottish journey. It's been a privilege to have you. Thank you. And Monica Barone, City of Sydney, good luck with where you're headed, Monica. Monica shared with me the discussion paper they have and a speech she gave recently, and is clearly very passionate about this, and we're really looking forward to seeing how that journey goes for you. Thank you, Monica. And thank you to you, our audience, for being part of the session. It's been, I've noticed people have stayed with us right to the end, and those who've registered but weren't able to join will, of course, get the recording in a day or so. So that just leaves me to thank you all and say good night, and please ask the panel members and VLGA staff to hang back for a quick debrief, and we look forward to seeing you for another global executive panel. I think we've got one earmarked for October. The topic at this point is a surprise.
That's
we'll
right.
let you know very soon.
Stay tuned.
Thanks very much all, and good night.
Good night and good
morning
morning.
to those of you in the UK.